Welcome to the Navigating Disruption podcast. I am your host, Mike Klein, and I'm joined by my co-host, Janet Hitchen. We have a very special guest today, Ann Melinger. Ann is an internationally recognized expert on organizational culture, employee engagement, and change management. As CEO and owner of Bink, she leads a team of senior advisors dedicated to helping life science companies and biotech companies build high-performing cultures that align with business strategy and fuel organizational performance. Welcome to the show, Ann.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a big fan.
Excellent, excellent. Want to kick off pretty quickly here. We were just having a conversation about, kind of the big trends that are hitting the whole organizational world at the moment. We're talking about AI wiping out large swaths of managerial and white-collar jobs. We've got a surge of young graduates coming into the workforce. And there's also kind of a lot of pressure coming into hierarchical organizations as management delayers and as the shift, things start to shift from trying to get everybody to be engaged to trying to get the remaining people to make the right decision. Which of these trends do you think is hitting the hardest right now? And where are organizations and practitioners most blind to the impact?
I'm excited to get into this one because I could argue a few perspectives, but I think from my perspective right now, I think it's the collapse of the hierarchical structures that's hitting the hardest, because I think AI is an accelerant. It's accelerating some of the challenges that are coming, and I think the generational shifts are as well. But to me, it seems like the deeper issue is that the traditional top-down structures for communications it's just not working, right? And I think that a lot of leaders out there are still communicating as if they're broadcasting to a very stable audience. But actually employees are not feeling stable. They're not stable. They are in fact not stable. Functions are changing, things are changing. And I think where communicators might be getting it wrong is making an assumption that if we have clear messages, they're going to be clearly understood. And I believe that assumption is not working. Having a great polished narrative that you're able to push out it's not working anymore. And I think it's much more important that we are more adaptable, that we're listening, and that we're creating sort of a two-way dialogue. The things that we've always been trying to do, but I think it becomes even more important with these shifts that are happening. That's my perspective.
It's really interesting that you say that, because I was at Turbocharge yesterday, which is going to tell, for those of us who know communications world, you now know exactly when we have recorded this. But I was at Turbocharge yesterday, which is IABC UK and Ireland, and Dr. Leandro Herrera was talking, and he was talking about organizational network analysis. And I know, Mike, you're a huge fan of this. You introduced me to it. You introduced me to Leandro and his work. And it was really interesting just to see him continue to talk about this. And his idea was comms needs to own this space because nobody else is. Everyone kind of goes, step back, not really sure, don't really know. Jump in, grab hold of it. Because if those hierarchical structures, as you say, Anne, are disappearing, then actually you need different ways of being able to look at the organization. Exactly. And ONA or SNA, however you want to call it, is actually a really great way of doing that. And you could see people in the audience kind of who'd never heard of this, having light bulb moments of, okay, this is huge. And his whole thing of, you need to be in it's quite an interesting way of talking about it, the infection business. So, depending on where you're at and whether there's a pandemic or not, it might be interesting sort of nomenclature. But it was an interesting take because he put two different pieces up on the screen, and he showed ONA in an organization, and he showed the spread of a virus and how viruses spread. And they were remarkably similar.
Brilliant.
And I thought that was...
He's a doctor and a psychiatrist, so he comes at this from a medical angle as well.
Yeah. But I think it's interesting, linking, just building on what you said, and that, if that organizational hierarchy is no longer there, what is there? What still exists that we as communication professionals can work with, adapt to, flex towards, own, as he was saying, like go in and own that space, go do that. And I thought that was incredibly powerful.
Absolutely. I mean, I think just the concept of going in and owning is something the
Yeah.
two of you preach constantly on this show, and I mean, I couldn't agree more. You know, we do need to go in and claim it, and again, it's shifting the way that we think about what our role is. Our role is not simply to create a clear message. That's just not enough anymore. It's much more than that, and we absolutely have the skills to do it.
I think what's interesting about I was just going to say what's interesting about this as well is, and I think we talked about this in one of our podcasts in the last season, I can't remember who it was with, but the Financial Times ran an article about the original organization chart, which was created by a designer and not an organizational structure person, and it looked completely different, and it looked a lot like the ONA charts that you see now. It was beautiful. It was like flowers blossoming out of a tree. It was divine. I mean, it was absolutely beautiful. But what it did was it showed a very different structure.
Yeah.
And it was done for the railways. How do railways work? So the CEO was there, but he wasn't at the top. He was part of the tree. And I thought that was really interesting that with ONA and SNA, you are getting back to that original 19th century view of an organization and how an organization functions.
Yes.
And it's interesting that we as communication professionals can look backwards to look forwards, which is kind of interesting.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And we're seeing it in the work that we're doing with clients. You know, my company's been around for 18 years. And while we were traditionally doing things like developing narratives and communications, we are now much more advising on how teams are structured, how they interact with each other, what are the norms. And it is definitely a shift from traditional, like I said, top-down communications. It's a shift in the way that we think and in the way that we operate. And I've also always enjoyed sort of that sitting at that intersection between communications and HR and bringing in some of those OE type, concepts and really marrying those two together. I think it's really powerful, and it is much more, it's a more business driven, outcomes driven perspective on the work that we do.
Question that I'm left with in this whole owning the space bit is the extent to which, there's any viable alternative to owning the space. Particularly if we don't step in and seize it, what's likely to happen? And that relates to a parallel question, which is, even if we get this, what's it going to take for us to get our leaders to get that we get this?
Oh boy.
Any thoughts on that one?
Anne? Over to you.
It's tricky. And that's a lot of times what we are brought in to help our clients do is to really try to elevate and make the case for it. I'm also a really big believer, I always have been, when it comes to conversations of owning any sort of space or taking any sort of risk or elevating our, influence in the organization. I'm a big believer that progress is better than perfection. And so even if we are not able to fully own the space, even if we have a leader who is, more traditionally minded view of what the communications function is responsible for, we shouldn't give up. We can't give up. Don't throw our hands up and go find a different organization. Try to find those smaller opportunities, one opportunity where you can actually change the conversation, where you can change what's happening. I'm a big believer in at least just start with one, because especially in these large, global, very complex organizations where the change is happening and it's the most blatant, making a difference is very difficult. And it's not something that that you can do easily or overnight. And simply by demanding a seat at the table, that's not going to cut it. And so finding those smaller opportunities to do so, finding maybe one business leader, one business unit, one pocket of the organization where you might be able to operate at that level, can create sort of a more bottoms up groundswell of opportunity. You asked the question, Mike. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I asked the question because I didn't have an answer myself. I mean, it could see I mean, I can see a number of different scenarios. I can see a function trying to do this. Probably the
Hmm.
most logical alternative would be a chief operating officer.
Hmm.
Yep.
Um, if the chief operating officer is holistically thinking enough of the organization
Sure.
rather than just simply getting product out the
Yep.
Hmm.
door. That would be and what I'm thinking myself is, do I need to be reaching out to chief operating officers about these shifts that are taking place? But I could see some other function like marketing, like HR, doing it in a way that's so slanted in their from their own perspective that it will literally, put a wrench in the entire organization.
Hmm.
So, I get a sense that we've got to raise our collective confidence way higher in a very short
Absolutely.
period of time for us to do this. Or we quickly need to find at least one ally, as you say, who can at least work with us, have his seat at the table or her seat at the table, be a platform for getting us into that room.
Yep.
I mean, from my perspective, just to build on what you've both said, is you need to find that leader who has a bit of budget, because
That's
owning that
true.
space is great, but also we all know that budgets they're getting smaller, we're getting less money, we still need to do some of that stuff, and you're like, oh, I want to do this analysis network, org network analysis is big. I'm not going to be able to fit that into my budget. That's going to take over, that's the cost of an event. I can't just get rid of the event. What do I do? But if you can work and pilot with somebody, and this is where the business partnering piece comes in, is really important. If you understand your business and you understand the business partners and what they're trying to achieve, and you can target the right partner because you understand what they're going for, you understand what their targets and their goals are for
Exactly.
the next year, instead of just going to it's because my thing is also chief operating officer is kind of where I go. But let's say they're like, we've got other priorities. If it's the CFO, for example, okay, I might be able to lean in here. So you're looking for a door that is either slightly ajar or you can lean on that's going to open more easily, and you try something. Who is
Mhm.
looking to reorg? Who is looking to restructure and not necessarily make redundancies, but actually better understand their organization, so that you can
Exactly.
say, hey, there's this idea. This could actually help us. Here's some of the science behind it. Here's some of the numbers behind it. Here's some of the analysis that's happened. And you're then speaking in that numbers language, which is great. And actually, that might be a really nice way of being able to pilot this and get somebody on board. But that relies on you knowing your business, you having
Absolutely.
great relations with your business partner, so that you can say, hey, I can't get this in my budget, but can you get it in yours? And actually, we try this and then we take it to the rest of the organization.
And being bold enough to take that step, to your point.
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah.
you've got to make that last step.
There's another piece, which is particularly in organizations that are shedding. We talked about Nestle at 16,000. Since
Yeah.
then, Amazon's come on board with 30,000, and we're seeing big name, big ticket companies doing this. This isn't just simply companies that are, that have been
Mm-mm.
teetering on the edge at some time. Um, that raises two issues. One is, how do you address the mindset in these companies about the safety that and the defensiveness that comes in as that kind of thing. But also, how do we help comms people navigate so that they can at least get into the door before the wave of layoffs comes in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting, especially when you look at some of these bigger companies that maybe they had the reputation of being safe, right? Of, oh,
Mm.
you're not
Yeah.
possibly going to get laid off from a Google or an Amazon or a Nestle. These industries and the size of these companies in particular was seen as very safe. And I think that the concept of safety and predictability is pretty much gone. I
Mm.
don't know that there's any pocket of corporate America where it is fully safe. I talk to people all the time that, are looking for advice as they're making changes in their career. And where should I go? Should I stay in house? Should I go to a big company? Should I go to an agency? Should I go to, and the answer is there is no great answer. There's no one white hope place that you can go and feel fully stable. And I think what that means for us as communicators and particularly for leaders is that we can't keep reassuring people that there is safety. I think we have to be honest. I think we have to be straightforward and transparent about what is changing. And I think that requires a lot of bravery on the part of leaders. I'm reading Brene Brown's new book right now, so we can probably lose count how many times I'm going to reference it. But she talks a lot about bravery and leadership bravery, and I think that's what it takes in this moment. Leaders have to be willing to be radically honest about what's happening, to acknowledge this is a scary time, and that it to me is much more helpful and much more likely to help ease the transition and the transformation than trying to resist it and trying to tell stories and, like we like to say, put lipstick on a pig.
Or glitter on something else, but we won't go there. I think I love what you said about bravery. I'm not reading Brene Brown because I find I'm better with Brene Brown when she talks, and when she's doing a podcast or when she's talking and doing one of her shows, I'm like, I am fully in. I struggle reading the book. I don't know why. I can't work it out. But I think what's interesting is actually being able to have that conversation. What I find really weird, though, is ever since I left university, 75,000 years ago, we were told it's a really bad time to be leaving university. It's a bad time for graduates. It's a bad time. Okay. So I went off and I worked in Tokyo because I was like, oh, but apparently it's a bad time in the UK. I'm off. I'm going to go do some adventuring and I'm going to go work somewhere else. But it feels like a lot of this is almost, there's a circularness to it. There's a circularity to it. It feels like there is no new message. It's always a bad year to be graduating. It's always, there is no safety. At one point it was you're safe if you're in the big four. Then it was you're safe if you're in financial services. Then it was you're safe if you're in tech. And so there's never there's a safe space that you can be. It might sort of slightly shift focus. And we've had a conversation with Dan Sodergren about the fifth industrial revolution. And that's how he talks about AI coming in. So maybe this is a bigger thing that's happening than has happened before. But it seems like the narrative is still the same. And from a narrative perspective, we've not changed it that much. Maybe what's at risk is bigger, but we've gone through these peaks and troughs. We've gone through Y2K bug. Oh my God, it's all going to go horribly wrong. We've gone through the financial crisis. We've gone through various different iterations and forms of COVID, etc. We've seen how that's kind of peaked and troughed. This is a bit of a weird one. It's an anomaly. But actually the narrative seems to be very similar to going back to when I left university and being told, oh, it's not great. Oh, you're never going to get a job. Oh, it's awful. Okay. It seems as if that's just what we want to create. And yes, there might be something there behind it, but actually that's what the media tells us. And does that become a self-fulfilling prophecy? I don't know.
I do think there's something to that as well. I think there is a lot of, because I have to always balance what I say. I do believe that leaders have to be honest and transparent. However, I also do believe that there is reason to feel optimism. And a lot of that is, to your point, Janet, looking at history. We are in a hugely transitional moment, but we've been in these hugely transitional moments before. And when the internet, think back to Y2K. We very clearly remember the number of jobs that were going and the number of companies that were collapsing and all the things and all the doom and gloom and fear. And, we made it. It's okay. It took time. And that's not to diminish the fact that there were real companies that collapsed and real jobs that were lost. And it's not to dismiss the fact that that's happening right now. And some of it is driven by AI. It is happening and it is painful. And it is also a part of history, and it will come back up. just with all economic indicators and researchers and people who know a whole lot more about this stuff than I do are all predicting a net gain of jobs over time. It's just that
Hmm.
we're in a difficult place right now, and I think we have to be honest and acknowledge that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's hard that it doesn't help if you're, I remember people talking about negative equity suddenly. Oh, my house is no longer worth what I paid for it. Oh, I'm this and this. And that's all incredibly difficult. And I'm not negating any of that. But there
Right.
is a sense of, okay, what does that mean? And how can I use that to balance out some of the things that I'm hearing and understanding? And does that mean actually I may need to shift, or are there people who need to? You're not going to go into exactly the same job. You may go into
Right.
something that is completely different. And I think we saw that post financial crisis where a lot of my friends in finance got made redundant, and many of them pivoted and became entrepreneurs. They started tech companies. They created startups. They did MBAs that went on to work in sustainability. You've got all of these sort of different options suddenly, and it's not very helpful if you're saying, "Look, I can't make my rent." And I get that. I absolutely
Absolutely.
get that.
Yeah.
And the last 2 years have been incredibly hard for
No
many people,
question.
me included. It's been
Yes.
rough.
Yeah.
But I think there is that sort of sense of, okay, so how do you pivot?
Hmm.
When I left university, I went to Tokyo. I could still do that again. you know?
There is something, you know, like you, I've been through a number of these cycles. I've been through, Y2K, 9/11, banking, all of this stuff. And there seems something fundamentally different about this one.
Hmm.
And it's not just, it's the confluence of those three factors. A
Yeah.
structural change to white collar employment, a structurally different influx of people coming into the workspace, and a genuine threat to the traditional top down one way direction of power in organization. And what really seems a threat is the mentality around the organizational social contract. There's always
Mm-hmm.
been a belief that you push loyalty and the implicit, we call it employee engagement. What we're really talking about is loyalty to a large extent. And there's an implicit agreement that loyalty will buy you safety. And now it's pretty clear that safety is pretty much out the window. What are
Hmm.
organizations going to offer their employees in return for their participation in this process?
Hmm. Yeah, and I think you're right. They can't offer them stability. That's just not something that most companies can offer without exception if they want to be, truly honest. And so it's more about who are we? Where are we going? What are the other intrinsic benefits of being a part of this effort? It's
Hmm.
not that, it's not a guarantee that we're going to be here forever. And, again, I think that takes a certain level of bravery and a certain willingness to acknowledge that and to acknowledge the losses and to acknowledge the fear. I think it's the only way.
Do you see any good examples of organizations moving in this?
That's a great question. I think I hear I was leading a panel discussion a few weeks ago with some communications leaders who talked about their own leaders' willingness to say, I don't know.
Hmm.
And I do believe that sense of being willing to say, I don't know is getting better. And I do
Hmm.
believe it takes communicators to encourage that and to help leaders shift what they believe is a good leader. A good leader is not always someone who can stand up and say, here's what to expect and map it all out, and there's going to be no surprises. That's not good leadership in this moment. What's good leadership is honesty, transparency, saying, I'm here, I'm in this with you. Here's what we're hoping for, here's what we're marching towards. I don't have all the answers today. And I think that's the shift. And I think we as communicators have to try to encourage leaders to make that shift.
You you do a lot of work in the life sciences world, And I find that world particularly interesting right now because we're talking about safe industries. There
Mhm.
is just, you know, conservative industries historically, at least for the last 20, 30 years. There's never been a more conservative, more stability oriented, more risk averse, more longevity motivated culturally set of organizations, particularly the old school pharma companies. How do you see these trends affecting those companies and how are they preparing for adapting to or not adapting?
Hmm.
Yeah. I think there's a distinction, an important distinction to be made between big pharma and small biotech. And I
Hmm.
think the growth of small biotech has actually had an impact on big pharma as well. I actually think that, especially with those smaller early stage biotechs, they're not particularly slow moving or risk averse. They are moving rather quickly.
Hmm.
They are moving as quickly as they can, of course, in the structures that they have to work in. They're working in a regulatory environment in the United States that has just been completely disrupted in the last few years, and
Hmm.
particularly in the last year. And so they are restricted to some extent by the systems they're working in. But I think they are operating at why I love this industry in particular is for two reasons. Number one, they're operating with extremely high stakes, right? They're doing
Hmm.
life-saving work. We often say the work we do is not about saving lives, but in their case it truly is. And it's with enormous complexity, and the complexity that comes with, you're dealing with things that can actually change lives in a complex regulatory environment.
Hmm.
And I think the combination of those two, of high stakes, high complexity, it yields some pretty interesting situations where you are seeing more and more leaders taking some bravery, leaning into things like AI for drug discovery. There's
Hmm.
a lot of companies that are leaning into it, not simply to accelerate the way they do work, but to actually accelerate discovery and to empower humans to discover and
Hmm.
accomplish more. And I think that it's interesting to see in these spaces how working in a way that is compliant and cautious can protect them in the future, but it can also paralyze them. We see
Hmm.
plenty of examples, to your point, Mike, of companies that are just completely paralyzed by, the regulatory environment that they work in. And then you see others that learn how to be cautious and smart and move forward. And I love the contradiction of working with probably half of our clients are big pharma and the other half are small startup biotechs. And the differences are they have a lot to learn from one another.
I was just going to ask, do you find that you get there's a lot of crossover? So actually, you're working with people and big pharma has gone to small, small has gone to big pharma, and they're going
Yes.
there for very different reasons. But actually, what they're bringing with them is a cultural sensitivity, an agility, a flexibility, a different way of working, different methodologies, those sorts of things. Are you finding that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many limitless examples of, big pharma where they're either through, they're hiring or they're even acquiring small companies, and then it
Yeah.
fails, right? You try to
Yeah.
bring
Yeah.
that mentality into a bigger company and forget it. You're doomed to fail.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there are also plenty of examples of where companies are being really thoughtful about, okay, we're acquiring this business. We're not just acquiring the technology, we're acquiring the culture. We like how quickly they get through their discovery process. We like how they approach different things. Let's learn from that. Let's actually make sure we're embracing that. We are seeing it, not across the board, of course, but
Yeah.
and you hear much more often about the failed attempts at it. But there
Yeah.
are some companies that are getting it right, and it's a matter of really looking at and being clear about what is the culture that we're trying to create here, and being clear on that, because if you're not, then you are going to just be at the mercy of whatever people are bringing in with their own expectations of culture.
I think what's interesting, and I can't remember the person's name, but somebody I follow on LinkedIn. Of course, when you follow like millions of people, you're like, I can't remember your name, but I know your content is great.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that he is sharing, and he talks a lot about culture, and he talks a lot about benefits, and the
Mm,
importance now of actually your benefits package and how
mm,
benefits work. Because if we think of some of those names that we talked about, Amazon paying the big bucks. So you went to Amazon because you got paid the big bucks. So you took some of the rough because you got, and that was the balance you made. Somewhere like Nestle, which felt really safe, you maybe didn't have as big a bucks, but actually you had stability, you had safety, you had a sense that you would be there for a longer period of time, and therefore that was the balance, that was kind of the thing that you did in order to, you accepted less money because you knew you were going to have a more stable sort of career. And so there were these different things, and everybody knew different companies, you go there for a different reason. And there were sort of some generalized reasons like that. And what this guy is looking at is actually, if all of that goes away, if there is no stability anymore, if there is no, if Amazon's not paying, yes, they're going to pay the big bucks, but you might not be there for very long. Actually, what does everybody else need to start looking at? And what is it? And sort of how do you look at that EVP? And what is that EVP? And it can't just be some words on a lovely postcard or some words that you stuck on a wall somewhere. It's got to actually mean something to the individual that's there. There's got to be some actual value. Clues in the name, EVP. Right. What is the value that you are bringing to that person, so that I bring my skills, I bring my energy, I bring my enthusiasm, I bring my know-how, and I'm getting some value back. And that's what the contract is all about. That's where I'm getting the additional. That's why I'm going to work for you. Because I know that stability's out of the window. I know that AI is forcing salaries down, or salaries are remaining quite stable. Because if you look at some communication professional salaries, I look at an internal comms manager 15 years ago, the amount that they're being paid was the same. Cost of living is not the same. So what's going on there? There's something not quite right. So what is the value that you're bringing? And suddenly that becomes a more interesting focus. And he's got very detailed on the individual things that organizations can do when they understand their demographic, when they understand who they've got working for them, when they understand the types of people that they're going to be approaching and having work for them. And so I think that's really interesting. How do communication, and I don't have an answer to that, but how do communication professionals understand that so they can start to adapt to the work that they're doing to look, so you're not just parroting some words that don't actually mean anything anymore.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up EVP. It's funny. I one of the reasons I love working in consulting is I feel like the type of work that we get over time is a real bellwether for the different trends in the space. We'll have a year where it's just all about intranets, and I would say right now it's been all about EVPs. This is a huge, this has become a much bigger priority because I think companies are realizing we can't offer necessarily stability. We can't necessarily offer the highest salaries. What are we offering? Why would people want to come here? What is the benefit? And really making sure that is clear. And we always start, to your point, Janet, we always start with talking to people, and you have to understand who your people are, where they are, and why are they there? Sit down with your top performers, ask them, why did you join? Why do you stay? What are the things that we offer? And really make sure that you're emphasizing those things. Maybe for some it is benefits. Maybe for some it's learning and development, but you can't make those assumptions. You need to know what it is.
100%. And also for some people, I mean, I've done work where people have said to me, it's money. I work here because I'm sending money home. I'm living away from my family, and I'm sending money home to my family. And I'm doing that in order to be able to. And so it's all about the money. And I'm like, okay, well, we've got to work with that. And there was a period where people went, oh, no, you can't possibly talk about the money because, oh, no, that's not, we can't do that. Why not? That's their key motivator. Work with it. Yeah. Because actually their key motivator behind the money is family. It's their family. It's how they're supporting their family. So they tell me money. You kind of do the 5 stages of why. I've landed with family. So you need money so that your family is looked after, your family is cared for. You have you have stability for your family in a region that may be unstable or unstable. I can't say.
Not stable.
Not stable. There we go. So I think that I think that's always really interesting to actually, as you say, understand what is motivating somebody. Right now, what's motivating me is adventure. Nobody else I know is probably going to have that a response. But it's always interesting to kind of go, oh, okay, what have we got here? Like, why? What is working for people? What is what are their own intrinsic values and how does that come out when it comes to
Exactly.
the organization? And I think that's a really interesting thing to do and to understand.
It's not just all about salary or security. I mean, there are a number of other reasons why people choose certain companies. In other parts of the world, prestige is hugely
Mm-hmm.
important.
Mm-hmm.
That,
Sure.
particularly in some countries, working for a recognized international brand name is much more valuable than working for a richer company that's got a more regional focus. I
Mm-hmm.
was talking recently for somebody who works for a health insurance company, a domestic health insurance company in the US that has 30,000 employees in India. How do they attract people to an organization that they will never do business
Yeah.
with? And conversely, the issue of autonomy, the issue of, not just learning, as you said, but the issue of autonomy, the issue of, being able to create a body of work that allow them to position themselves better in the future. I mean, there are other alternatives to this. I guess the
Yeah.
issue is to what extent a more progressive approach to EVP is palatable to managers and leaders who are still, coming at this from a 20th century perspective.
Yeah. And it does go back to right back where we started around, hierarchy, and that even an EVP cannot be a top-down exercise. You
Yeah.
can't sit down and decide this is who we want to be and this is what we want people to like about working here, and then just push it out from the top down. You have to talk to people. You have to understand. You raise an interesting point, Mike, about, employees in India. One of the most common questions we get about building EVPs is, do we need one for, every function or one for every location? And it's like, no, you need to have one that works for everyone, but you may need to know how to tailor it to those different people with those very different experiences. Because again, you can't broadcast one message out and expect everyone to hear it and resonate with it. So you do have to take that more holistic approach that is much more grounded in listening, responding, and understanding the people that are there and what motivates them, and how can we continue to motivate them in a realistic way. I think a lot of times there's the tendency to want to make this aspirational. We strive for this, and it's like, no, 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 no. That's so much worse. Don't even bother. You're actually going to do more harm than good if you go out with an EVP that is fully aspirational. Better to say nothing at all. Has to be grounded in your people's reality.
It's interesting because I know when I was working at Apple, and Apple doesn't have an EVP. Well, they wouldn't say it was an EVP because that sounds like naff. They would call it a credo because that's what it is. It's the credo. And I remember when Bricks and Mortar came together with Online, and there was a review of the credo because the credo came from Bricks and Mortar. So everyone online's kind of going, okay, great, but it doesn't really feel like it's ours. So how do you allow that to come together? And what was absolutely fascinating was this beautiful piece of poetry, essentially, came out, and it was quite long. And so one of the things when I was doing some, how do we get people on board with this? How do we get people to take ownership of this and to understand this? How do we work with leaders in Europe to actually understand what this means and how can they talk with their teams about it? And I said, you don't have to take the whole thing. You can take one part of it, and you can personalize that. And as long as you have a personal story that links to one value, one word, one sentence, one part of it, and that resonates, and you can really share and be, all of the wonderful words, vulnerable, brave, however you want to describe it, to actually use that. And we did a wonderful session where everybody chose just one sentence and then gave an example as to why that sentence was important to them. And it was one of the most warm, rich, fulfilling sessions that we ever did, because suddenly they realized, oh my God, the original thing was, I'm going to have to memorize this thing. I don't like memorizing things. I don't really know what it is. I don't want to have to understand the whole thing. It's like, no, the whole thing is there.
Yeah.
But you can choose when you're talking about it to have just one piece and one part of that. And I still remember what my one part of that was. My
That's
one
beautiful.
part was, we shine a spotlight only to stand outside of it. And I was like, that's what we do as communication professionals. We shine that spotlight on people, and we don't need to be in the spotlight. I don't need to be dancing in the spotlight. I'm very happy to do and I had wonderful examples of where we had done that, where that had happened with both employees and with customers. And I think that once you have that, that's incredibly powerful, because you've personalized it, and the meaning suddenly, everyone can take one word, one sentence, and that meaning can be so different. And actually allowing that gives you color, it gives vibrancy, it gives depth, it gives warmth to what you're trying to achieve.
I love that. I often use the metaphor of like the recording booth with all the dials, the sliders
Yeah.
that you can slide up and down. And the sliders are all the same for everyone. That's your EVP for the whole corporation. But for different functions, different roles, different generations, you might turn one slider up and the other one down, but they are all the same. I love that, Janet.
Yeah.
I guess the question becomes, and this also speaks to the larger issue of values and priorities, is what happens when the inevitable contradictions occur, to what extent are you seeing more and more of these contradictions, and how do you see people managing them?
Yeah, it's always interesting, because I think that, again, my perspective is a little bit biased, because the companies that I'm working with are working with us, and therefore they know that they need to make a commitment to operationalizing their values. So I'm sort of like getting in many ways the best of the best. So I do feel like my perspective is often a little bit skewed, and I have to keep that in mind. But there are plenty of examples out there, countless examples out there of companies that, say one thing, proclaim one thing, and do something else. I often say that values are, what shows up when your company's under pressure. Those are your true values. And I think it's a really important thing I actually just got back from an offsite with my own team where we looked at our own values. And I went into that expecting nothing would change. Our values are fine. They're only a few years old. They're fully operationalized into the business. We use them every day. We talk about them. But when we really sat down to look at them and really look at some of the words and some of the behaviors that we had defined in there, we all were like, actually, this isn't really resonating anymore. And so I think that it's important to make sure you're looking at them regularly, and really they have to be operationalized within your business and living them. But also you sometimes have to take a big step back and say, are we actually looking at them? Are we actually living them? I was speaking with someone recently who said the best thing you can do is audit your last 100 business decisions and determine whether or not your values are actually showing up, which really gets to that point, Mike, of the connection between values and priorities. I think what gets prioritized is what you value, and those things have to be in concert, or else that's not your values. Something else is just words. It's not your values.
Yeah. I love that. And I love the fact that you've taken the time out to kind of, it's like we always say, like the cobbler always has the worst shoes. And so it's actually making sure that you're living you're doing what you say, and
Absolutely.
being honest about it. And there is something lovely about sort of going, well, we had this and it kind of worked for us for a while. It worked for us back then, but the world is different now. We are different now. We're working with different clients. We're doing different things. So actually, do those things still hold true? And there's something really almost liberating about being able to do that, I think.
Absolutely.
I know we wanted to make sure that we kind of come in, because you've got a hard stop at quite soon. So there's one question that we had discussed, and I really want to focus in on this one, because I'm like, ooh, this is a good question. We've talked about business partnering. We've talked about strategic alignment for about 15 years, and just earlier we talked about the importance of business partnering relationships. Mm-hmm. We're still having those conversations, and people are still having kind of like aha moments that this is actually where we need to be as a communication function and a profession. What will it actually take to shift the profession to actually make this our regular day to day, and to stop this feeling like it's Groundhog Day of revelation?
What a great question. I mean,
Sorry, big question.
I think it's a good one to end on. And I think it is, I think as an industry, we are constantly talking about how to prove our value, right? And I think that what the shift will take is focusing on creating our value instead of proving it, actually creating it. And I think, we still see it's amazing how much we still see communicators measuring themselves by deliverables, by outputs, by vanity metrics. I was just talking with my head of research about this the other day, and she's like, I just want to bang my head against the wall every time I see an end of year report that talks about how many newsletter issues we sent out. We have
Who
to
cares?
stop. Exactly. And so really starting to look at ourselves through the lens of business outcomes. It's not easy. It's a bigger risk, but we have to do it. And if we don't start measuring ourselves that way, then we're going to keep having the same conversation. But I think I'm always an optimist. I'm a hope junkie. I really do think that the fact that we're in the midst of this massive transformation, let's just call it chaos, because that is what it is. I think it is forcing the evolution. I think that the introduction of AI and all the changes that are happening, it is forcing the evolution. And those who do think about creating value rather than proving value are the ones who will survive and thrive.
I find it fascinating. I mean, I'm asking the question because I also have an answer, and it's like I just find it stunning and shocking. When I worked at Apple for 10 years, and we never measured this is the number of things that we sent. We never measured that stuff. When I ran iPhone globally, we measured ourselves on the number of iPhones that were sold. When that was my measurement.
Shocking.
Surprise. When we did things about accessories, we measured ourselves on the number of SKUs that were linked to the campaign that we had just run for end of year or for the holiday season and those sorts of things. And I've got a story that I tell, and I'll tell it again. But very briefly, which is when we looked at comms measurements, it failed. When we looked at business measurements, it was a wild success. And I walked into a meeting thinking, the only stats that I have to talk about on this that I own, that I can bring to the meeting, because I'm coming to the meeting hoping I get my business stats, but anything I'm bringing doesn't show this as a great success. And literally, we walked in and it was, this is amazing, this is wonderful. Thank God I kept my mouth shut, because actually, I was told this is wild, this is wonderful, we are doing great guns, the communication is working. Fabulous. Now, on my stats, I could then look at, well, how is this working? And it gave me some really interesting, not the number, we weren't expecting this volume of people, what's actually happened? And we were able to break down that busy period. Stores decided that 3 people would look at this piece of communication and they would spread it by word of mouth. They would infect, to come back to Dr. Leandro Herrera's comment, they would infect the rest of the retail store to make sure that they all knew, everybody was working, but actually the number of hits my thing got, not great, infection rate, off the charts. So I think
that takes bravery, though. That takes bravery to bring it back to bravery. You have to be willing, if you're going to tie your work to business outcomes, you have to be willing to make that link even when business is down. And I think that's where the fear comes in, is we're afraid to tie ourselves, but there's so many other things that might influence how many iPhones are sold. And so we have that fear. And how could we possibly take any credit for that? We lack that confidence. And so it takes a sense of bravery to be able to do that.
I mean, for me, it was a sense of relationships. I had the partnerships in order to be able to do that. So I felt because it was as though you're very confident. No, I did the work in order to have the confidence. I had the relationships. I had the basis of understanding to know that we had worked together as a collaborative team. And it wasn't just me, it was a team of us working together on that thing. And that, if you do that work, that creates confidence, that allows you to feel brave. My head wasn't above the parapet. Lots of people think it was. It wasn't. I was part of a team that worked together on this, that designed this together, that collaboratively decided that these were the metrics that were important.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of that simple. It's if you're working together with your team and with the business to do that. Whereas if you're working on your own at your desk and you go, oh, what are my metrics? What do I own?
Right.
Oh, they're little and tiny and they're not helpful.
Right.
It's not great.
Right.
So for me, it's
whatever
relationships.
Absolutely. And whatever fear there is that exists around AI or any of these other changes, I think that as we become strategic advisors and as we view ourselves as people who can influence business outcomes, that we are shaping the direction of the business, that we need to be embedded in key business decisions, then those are the ones who will survive.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I'm just looking at the time, and Anne, I want to be respectful of your time. I know Mike's probably got like 75 more questions that he wants to ask you, so maybe we get you back for next season.
We might need a part 2.
We might need part 2.
I'd actually like to get you and your research director on this.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That
yes,
could be
she
really
has lots
nuclear.
to say. Yeah, she's got lots to say.
But for this
Excellent.
session, Anne, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. It's been a joy. I love talking with you both, and I would happily welcome the opportunity to do it again.
So, Mike, we've just wrapped an amazing conversation with Anne. What are your thoughts?
There's a lot to think about. There is so much going on in the business world at the moment, and this whole issue, the whole EVP, or what I call the social contract, which has basically been, you give us loyalty, we'll give you security. That's been the social contract. Yeah. And that's gone out of the window. And what we really talked about is, okay, given that that's out the window, what do we do now? And we definitely saw such a relationship between the comms perspective, the EVP perspective, and ultimately the the overall business momentum perspective. I mean, we didn't really come up with any answers, but we came up with some pretty good insights that are going to produce some good questions. I think the one big thing that Anne was talking about and hammering home, bravery, bravery, bravery. In a time when there's no safety, bravery is pretty much the only option. And, that was crystal clear from what she had to say. What was your take on it?
As somebody who was often told she is blessed with the bravery gene, and oh, aren't you so confident? I'm not particularly brave. I'm not particularly confident, in my opinion. But what I do is I create situations where I can build on a solid foundation of relationship, so that I can be brave. I can ask a difficult question. I can challenge something. I can have an open conversation because we have an initial understanding of who we are, what we care about, and we have a really solid relationship. And so I thought it was really interesting to hear her talk about that specifically. And I think, yes, we didn't come up with huge. I don't think it's about necessarily having a solution-based conversation or a solution-driven conversation. I think often it's about trying to kind of talk around this and go, where are we with this? And do people recognize some of the things that we're talking about, and can they recognize themselves in some of the challenges that we see? And actually, what would be great is when we post this and when it goes live, let's start a conversation. This is not about us having all of the answers and shoving out all of the answers so that people can go and get spoon-fed with them and take them away. It's about dialogue. It's about conversation. It's about a discussion. It's about a debate. And I think it would be great if people joined that debate and kind of gave us what they think about the stuff that we were talking about. I think that would be really helpful. That's how we move this stuff along. That's how the communication profession advances. We're good at talking. We're good at connecting. So can we be good at debating and moving that stuff forward?
I hope moving from debate to action.
Yeah, which is the perfect next step.